never seen nothing like it. Swear, for a second, he was flying.
Oh, come on, man.
I've been waiting for this game for several years, and now that I finally have it, it feels underwhelming. So many delays and hype surrounding this game, and yet, now that it's here, almost no one is talking about it. There are a few exceptions, of course, but overall there seems to be more apathy towards this game than its predecessor. I feel one of the reasons for that is that it was released in an unfortunate time, 1 week after Pokemon Legends Arceus and 2 weeks before Elden Ring, both highly anticipated open-world games that sold insanely well at launch. The reason I care about Dying Light 2 more than these two, however, is that I've never played a Pokemon game and I don't plan to start now. I've played Bloodborne and a bit of Dark Souls 3, and I just don't think Elden Ring is for me. But I've played hundreds of hours of Dying Light, and it's one of my favorite open-world games. I don't think it's only because of the timing, however. Techland boasted that the game had 500 hours of content, but after around 50 hours of playtime, I feel like I've seen everything the game has to offer. Not that the gameplay gets boring, anything but. The map is filled with filler content and repetitive activities, and the progression is over before you even finish the story. In fact, the gameplay was the only thing that kept me playing. I'm sure, just like Dying Light 1, that after a few years and tons of updates/expansions, the game will be filled to the brim with much more content of much better quality, but until that point we are left with an emptiness. The New Game Plus feature alone was added 2 months after the game was released, and it doesn't even let you keep the grappling hook, so it's automatically worse than Dying Light. There are still very interesting innovations and changes in Dying Light 2 that I'd like to give light to. Yeah, thank you. A plague that ravages the world comes by surprise to the public. The tone of this premise is dark and desolate, much like the bubonic plague was in the 11th century, and the aesthetic complements that. The world is filled with earthy tones and bleached sunlight. The concrete structures and rusted metal conveys a harsh and decaying environment. Night became an oppressive void, solely illuminated by torchlight. The soundtrack is filled with ominous synths and harrowing strings. The sound design is dead quiet or ear-piercingly horrid. Screeches of the undead and gunshots can be heard all over the map. Haran is a diseased, cold place where all hope has been poisoned. That feeling is still prominent after hundreds of hours of gameplay. The story might not be that good, but the side quests reinforce this tone and theme. The time frame that takes place in means that not all technology is defective, and common tools are still in use. Its writing is dark and desolate. Side quests are for the most part about hopeless situations and depressing realities. There's a piece of world building in the safe house where you slowly realize that the people who stayed there previously committed mass suicide to escape the dreadful world around them. Dying Light 1 is a nihilistic zombie horror game. Every ending is incredibly dark and hopeless. Dying Light 2 completely flips this on its head. If Dying Light 1 is the Dark Ages, then Dying Light 2 is the Renaissance, a rebirth of the post-apocalyptic aesthetic. Not a retro sci-fi aesthetic, not a concrete jungle, but a medieval takeover. Nature is growing above the ruins. It visually shows life rising above death. The amount of colors in this game is unbelievable. Every part of the landscape is teeming with vivid color palettes and warm lighting. Humans live exclusively on rooftops, and the architecture reflects that of castles and rustic villages. The tools and weapons you use are made of repurposed materials and of scraps. The clothes NPCs wear resemble that of tunics and shawls. The soundtrack is full of triumphant horns and percussion, uplifting strings and flutes. The writing is much more hopeful. One of the side quests is about discovering a bird's nest on a radio tower, suggesting that the air could be clearing up and normal life could be possible in the future.
If nature is returning to the city, it means the air is getting cleaner. The amount of chemical particulates in the air is going down.
Dying Light 2 is a romanticist fantasy action game. The world is jaw-droppingly beautiful in looks, sound design, and writing. It is almost a complete 180 from the original Dying Light in every way. The Renaissance was defined by a defiance of higher powers, specifically that of the divine. Reliance on religion and spirituality was exchanged with reliance on the human mind and self-determinism. This was later referred to as humanism. Dying Light 2 is an extremely humanist game, both in story and gameplay. The subtitle "Stay Human" is fitting in more ways than one. The big new feature of this game is the choices you can make throughout the story and side quests. These choices aren't really that important. Most of the dialogue choices are between extending the dialogue sequence or finishing it. The choices in the side quests decide whether you help someone or tell the truth. I've played the story twice, making different choices each time, and I've found that they don't change where you end up, but they do change what quests you do and how you get there. One of my favorite choices is giving the radio tower to the fascist, or the anarchist bi fuckboy Juan. Speaking of Juan, the character work in this game is a huge improvement over DL1. Just looking at the main female character from both games should tell you how much they've improved their characters. Not that Lawan is that brilliant, but do you remember a single personality trait of Jade? I bet you don't. I had to check on the wiki if that was her actual name. Lawan has agency and acts on her own motivations more than that of Aiden's, but again, it's not perfect. The protagonist has the ultimate agency, and most of the time she's kind of just wrapped up in what Aiden's doing, so it's not perfect. I mentioned that DL2 is romanticist, but it's also lowercase romantic. A lot of the side quests are about relationships, be that family or lover. There are quite a few about fixing relationships or finding relationships, and some of them are really memorable, like It's Alive, an allusion to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Its premise is that an old man asks you to help him regain electricity to his apartment so he can bring it back his wife. This setup leads the player to believe that he will actually make his wife undead, from the title and pitch. But the payoff to this quest is that he has a voice message from his wife before the apocalypse.
Hello, darling.
It's so nice to hear your voice again, Megan.
There were no crinkle cut fries, so I bought plain ones. You don't mind, do you?
Sure, they can be plain.
Why don't we watch something tonight? I'll be home soon. Bye.
Is that your wife?
It's a genius subversion, and it makes meaningful comment on the value of preservation through external means and the immortality of a soul. From the research I've done for the Fallout New Vegas video, I found this quest even more valuable and impactful. It's also just a beautiful, concise vignette, which is one of my favorite kind of quests. This extended theme of humanistic storytelling is so well integrated into the writing and gameplay. To add to this humanist tone, you can also sit at these campfires or theaters, where regular citizens can perform short stories that you can listen to in their entirety, which is a fascinating thing which I don't think I've seen in any other open world game up to this point. The writing isn't all good, however. The dialogue is very flat and uninteresting, but it's functional for getting the point across. There is obviously a difference between good writing and writing that serves a purpose. This might be a small thing, but merely the choice to have Aiden's infection be a constant threat and something that has to be managed as opposed to it being an occasional event in the story adds to the sense of player choice, rather than being something written by a higher power. The same can be said of the final boss fight, which, despite what problems other people have pointed out, at least it's not a series of unforgiving QuickTime events. When people talk about ludonarrative dissonance, they are actually talking about textual integrity, which is a more niche concept, but is essentially when a text explores a theme or idea across every aspect of their form and language. So when I say that a game has textual integrity, that's what I mean. I should also mention that this game has a pretty progressive view on sexuality, especially for a Polish game. Another thing the Renaissance is defined by is innovation, and Dying Light 2 has that in spades. The parkour here is possibly the best it will ever be. I honestly can't think of a single change or addition that can improve this parkour system. Every single skill and tool adds so much to the system that once you unlock one, you can't go back to how it played before. It's a system that encourages using every tool at your disposal in every situation. The best way to convey this is by looking at how they've changed the grappling hook from the first game. In Dying Light, the grappling hook was a tool you unlocked halfway through the survival skill tree. You use it as a quick escape or a way to bypass a large gap or height. It also has limited uses, encouraging you to use it sparingly in certain situations. You press the left trigger and you go to that location. In Dying Light 2, you get the grappling hook in a story mission and have to use it to progress that mission. Its base ability is to make a rope to swing on. You press left bumper and it doesn't take you to that location, but it assists you in getting to that location. It relies on momentum and timing to be useful. It also has unlimited uses, only restricted by your stamina bar, so it encourages you to use it alongside your other parkour abilities. That's only the base level, however. The next upgrade brings it a little closer to the original orientation, where it pulls you towards the surface you attach it to. If you press the left bumper twice, you can use the grappling hook to help close a gap or give you a boost of speed while freerunning. The final upgrade gives you the ability to pull enemies towards you, and this doesn't add as much to the parkour, unless you want to gain a speed boost from an enemy, but What it does do is add to the combat. If you combine the skill with the stomp, it's an easy way of dispatching normal enemies quickly. You can also use it to fling enemies off buildings. As you can see, the situations you can use a grappling hook for in Dying Light 2 is almost limitless. I haven't even mentioned the power glider, but this goes for pretty much every part of the parkour, which leads me to the combat. The developers spoke a lot about how they wanted to close the gap between parkour and combat, and I think they've done a pretty good job. Combat against humans in Dying Light was not very good. You could almost say it was not functional at all. All you could do was mash the attack button and dodge occasionally, or just use a gun. There was no real strategy or skill required to fighting. Dying Light 2 makes improvements to the AI and combat abilities. Enemies can now climb, which makes sense given they've been living above ground level for about 20 years. There are several attacks that use parkour like the vault kick or the jump kick. You can also block now, which has been a basic feature in almost every fighting game, but it's here now, and it works. Enemies adapt to your actions, so you can't spam dropkick anymore, and it forces you to shake up your attacks. In the rare occurrence that removing a feature improves a game, Dying Light 2 doesn't have guns anymore, except as consumables. And this is much better because gunplay in Dying Light was extremely boring and ruined the scaling. They even made a lore reason for the lack of guns, which is a detail they didn't have to add, but did anyway. Dying Light 2 also adds fast travel. Well, there was technically travel between the two districts in DL, but in this they aren't completely separated. One thing that annoys me is that you can see both districts from anywhere on the map, and yet it stops you from going to one district from the other without using fast travel. The world of Dying Light 2 is about innovation. A lot of the quests are about creating or rebuilding above the old world. It's honestly fascinating playing a post-apocalyptic game that actually takes place in the rebuilding of society rather than destruction or the retaining of the status quo. Rather than showing a world that has been rebuilt or one that has just been destroyed, it shows the in-between period where people are truly striving to make a new world. A world that may learn from the mistakes of its past. With the advent of humanism came a distrust and lack of faith in the authorities. The church was helpless during the plague, and people started to question just how reliable the authorities were. Power structures started to change, and that's exactly what has happened with Dying Light 2. Zombies in DL2 have become a secondary threat. No longer are they numerous or scary. Volatiles are basically hidden from the player. The whole hook of the Dying Light franchise is now an afterthought. This isn't a criticism, however. It has been about 20 years since the first game, so the infection is no longer unknown and unmanageable. People have learned to live with the undead and thrive among them. The most obvious example of this shift is that zombies don't show up in rooftops anymore. In Dying Light, zombies were everywhere, and they would be a constant threat to the player, even in places where they thought they would be safe. Dying Light 2 clearly defines where zombies can be and where they can't be. As a replacement, there are many more humans in the open world, fitting with the humanist tone. You can see them actually doing things and interacting with each other, or sometimes they're enemies that attack you on sight. Humans are actively taking reign over the zombies. Even though thematically it works, gameplay-wise it's easy to critique. Rooftops are basically completely safe for the player, so the place where you'll be spending most of the game has no friction. They kind of fixed that with the city map, where rooftops are for the most part unreachable, so a majority of the time you'll go inside them, where zombies are sleeping. Honestly, at some point I feel like the zombies serve no purpose in the gameplay, and for a game based on that, it feels more like a letdown. Nowhere is this shift in power more prominent than in
Day and night.
Shut up, I know Purposeless Rabbit Holes did this joke already, just let me have this. Day and Night in Dying Light was purposely dichotomous. The gameplay of one did not resemble the gameplay of the other. Nighttime became more of a stealth horror game, which was fascinating. The time of day pretty much morphed into a new game. One complaint about nighttime in Dying Light was that there wasn't enough incentive for exploring at night, so people would just skip it. For me, the arc of overcoming the fear of exploring at night was the reward in and of itself, but the developers didn't seem to think so. Dying Light 2's nighttime is less oppressive, less diverse, and more lucrative. The substitute for nighttime's difficulty is dungeons. They are buildings, but they function as dungeons. They have a lot of rewards and also a lot of zombies. During daytime, it's almost impossible to come out of these alive, but during nighttime, it's easier. These buildings are supposed to be the stealth gameplay missing in the open world. The only problem is that if you fail stealth, you don't get jumped by super powerful enemies, so if you have strong enough weapons, there's basically no reason to commit to stealth. Again, thematically this makes sense, and theoretically it's good to have nighttime be a viable option for players, but in practice it's just a time period that has some activities that are arbitrarily blocked during the day. These shifting powers have also led to more RPG mechanics that have honestly hindered the experience more than it has improved it. You can now customize every piece of your outfit, and every piece of clothing has pointless stat bonuses, so you'll be spending an inordinate amount of time managing what clothes you wear. The clothing you find does look pretty nice, and it does add an element of personalization, but that's kind of undermined by having to wear the clothes with the highest numbers. Did I mention there's now an inventory limit? Not for individual item categories. There's a universal inventory limit. So if you have dozens of clothing items because you can't be bothered to drop them, which you will since everything you loot will have them, you won't be able to pick up fundamental crafting items, which are actually important to surviving. I really do not understand the reasoning behind this decision. It doesn't add to the immersion because you can fit hundreds of shirts but you can't pick up a few screws. It doesn't add to the decision making because the only sacrifice you'd ever make is dropping a pair of Nikes for a nice looking crystal. It's just there to inconvenience the player. They also got rid of weapon repairing, which was an interesting mechanic in the original, as it was a long animation that added stress to already stressful situations, and you had to sacrifice materials to do it. Now whenever a weapon breaks, you just drop it and move on to the next one. These changes are a side effect of something that I'll talk about later, but it fits with the shift in tone this game is going for. You can now side with factions to gain certain benefits. If you side with the fascists, you get a cool crossbow. If you side with the farmers, you get, better zip lines. People can revive you if you die in certain areas. So, ideologically, it doesn't matter what faction you side with, and it doesn't affect the story whatsoever. It also doesn't affect the world as much as it promised in the marketing, which I should probably talk about that, huh? Dying Light 2 was made during a plague, and I'm not just talking about the physical disease. A plague of toxic working environments and stubborn management. A plague that is currently affecting lots of companies. The ex-lead writer of Dying Light 2, Chris Avallone, who had previously worked on Fallout New Vegas, was fired after several sexual harassment allegations. This meant several rewrites and restructuring of the narrative. The mission that was shown off in E3 2019 seemed as though it would take place towards the beginning or middle of the game, and includes the protagonist making a decision that affects the world. In the final release, that mission is the epilogue, and it has no bearing on the open world. The management were apparently extremely rigid in their idea of what features the game would have, and anyone who suggested otherwise was shut down. As developers at Techland explain, whenever an expert starts advising things that are not aligned with the board's agenda, they slowly get isolated from the project and responsibilities. That leads to them leaving or eventually getting fired. To make a career at Techland, you have to be subservient. This definitely slowed down development and had a negative impact on how the game was released. It's very interesting looking back at the E3 presentations from 2018 and 2019, as it seems we could have gotten a game that was very aesthetically similar to Dying Light. The colors were much more earthy and dull, just like the first game. The architecture was much more gothic horror inspired. What I imagine is that in 2020, when an actual virus hit, they didn't want to have as drab a tone and decided to liven things up to an exaggerated degree. I wouldn't say that I'm upset at this decision. In fact, I think the vivid aesthetic fits much better, but looking at the architecture, it's obvious that they had to limit the complexity for launch, and the diverse layered gothic designs became plain geometric shapes with a hint of European inspiration. Also, I believe the Renegade faction in the game were going to be an actual faction that you could side with, which would have made the game a lot more interesting, but unfortunately that was also removed. Something interesting that I found is that if you look closer at the epilogue cutscenes, you can see the clear indicators that they were made pre-2020, given their lack of color and more interesting architecture design. Also, the graphics look much worse in the actual game, but that's beside the point. Dying Light 2 has also been infected by the open world plague that has been incubating in Ubisoft over the past decade or so. The 500 hours that was boasted is divided into 30 hours of story, a few really good side quests, dozens of fetch quests, and 450 hours of copy-paste activities and collectibles. This isn't as egregious as Assassin's Creed or Far Cry because just the act of playing the game is fun, so it's not as boring. Also, the activities take some amount of effort to complete. The worst one is definitely the GRE anomalies. It's the exact same boss fight 20 times with barely any variation in difficulty or environment. There are no interesting patterns of attacks, all it does is jump around the arena and release poison balls. After the first one, I thought to myself, okay, that was cool, I hope that was it. The huge amount of icons and HUD elements detract from the visual design and beauty of Dying Light 2 and overwhelms the player with information that doesn't need to be shown. And don't get me started on the menus. I wish this plague would go away, but of course people still congregate anyway and catch it despite knowing its harm. I complained quite a lot in the last 2 chapters, but honestly I still love this game. It's so much fun and it makes interesting decisions despite some of them being wrong ones. I much prefer a sequel that experiments than a sequel that reiterates. Although all of that does not a successful game make. It makes sense why no one is talking about this game right now, but perhaps in a few years it will be praised for its flawless parkour system and beautiful world. I think one of the main reasons for all the additions and changes, aside from the toxic management, is that Techland didn't want to make another zombie game. They've mentioned several times that they are working on a fantasy open world RPG, and I think that their priorities and resources were centrally focused on that rather than a sequel to a game that they were finished with. I'm honestly quite curious what a fantasy RPG from Techland would look like, but for right now, I do appreciate what Dying Light 2 has to offer. I'm pretty sick of sequels that are solely made to profit off of a name, like Assassin's Creed or Fallout, and gamers are helping to perpetuate it, and not only with their money. I've seen several videos from people talking about a series of games that hasn't released something in a while or went downhill after the second game and begging for a sequel or reboot to be made. But I think releasing a new installment that is returning to form, quote unquote, is useless because instead of advancing the video game landscape, it's just cycling the same ideas over and over again. I'm willing to bet that if Ubisoft stopped releasing Assassin's Creed games, in 5 years people will be begging for them to make another one. I absolutely hate the idea of sequels or remakes unless it was actually planned, like Batman Arkham City and Night, or completely diverges from the original, like the Resident Evil 2 remake. But the video game industry runs on sequels and remakes. Once again, the indie scene is a cure to this regurgitation, but even they are subject to sequel demands, which is exactly what the recent Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe Edition makes fun of.
This is literally the Dying Light 2 logo.
Again, I don't think Dying Light 2 is a bad sequel, but it's one that Techland was somewhat forced to create. I wanted to make a point with this video that I've been really invested in recently and share something that I've discovered. I also really wanted to talk about Dying Light 2 because I think there's a lot to say and I still haven't even talked about everything the game has to offer since I haven't 100%ed it. And also, it will definitely improve over the next few years. I also didn't want to talk about the bugs because I feel like that's kind of a useless criticism because people who are watching this in the future will not see that at all, so it just would render the criticism useless. By the way, I've mentioned the Fallout New Vegas video quite a few times recently, and the reason I haven't got that out yet is honestly just because I don't want to play the game to record footage. That's not because the game is bad in any way. I think it just requires a lot of patience and time investment because I realize that the gameplay itself is really boring and the base movement speed is extremely slow and there are no alternatives to walking. So moving from point A to B is just the most patience testing thing. So it's gonna take a lot longer. I'll probably have to wait until like, I don't know, the end of this year maybe to get it out when I have more time and more patience. But yeah, sorry about that. I will be making videos in the meantime like this one. But yeah, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.